What up, what up, what up, what up? It's me, L Teddy 27.
Good as night, right about the hood.
Oh, dear God, I'm already eating a drink.
Look a damn mess, just a damn mess. No means no, and yes means no.
What up, what up, what up, what up, what up? What's good? What's up, people? It's me, L Teddy 27, and I am back here for another review. This review is a special review. This is going to be our review for the Netflix original documentary, Disclosure. I came upon this documentary from one of my subscribers, Sir James. Thank you so much. You know who you are. Thank you so much for putting me on to this documentary. I did not know that it was on Netflix, but when I stumbled upon it, and it took me a couple days to get down to watching it because I was so busy, and I watched it and I said, yeah, let's have this conversation. Let's talk about this. And it is a wonderfully filmed documentary. Wonderful conversations are had. You can find it on Netflix. It's called Disclosure, and I encourage you to watch it. You can watch it after this. It's not like I'm going to be exposing anything because it is a documentary, but I certainly would advise, encourage you to go and watch it yourself so that you can see all of the things that I am talking about. Okay. Fixing my light. Don't judge me. Okay. Don't judge me. Y'all know I have my little antics or whatever. I fix my lighting. All right, so let's delve right into it because it's about 2 hours, not quite 2 hours. It's about an hour and 45 minutes, but it's not like it's a hard hour and 45 minutes. You start it, and then with the stories that are being told and the interviews and the line of questioning and the topics that are brought up, you kind of get, entranced into it, and you forget that, it's as long as it is. But it was great. It was a great documentary. So let's talk about it. So here, this documentary is all about the trans community, our trans men, our trans women, and all trans people, and what it means to be trans, and the history of trans people with film, television, and the media, going all the way back to its beginnings to where it is today, and how that impacts the lives of trans people in general. So we start off, and they got everybody on there. You got some of you name it, they have them on there. Some of the great, you have your Laverne Coxes and stuff like that. And you have, Lily Wachowski, and just so many pioneers in the trans community, your Janet Mox and your MJ Rodriguez, and you got all kinds of trans people on here, trans men, trans women, and they are just telling what it means to be trans and explaining the history and talking about what it means. Sandra Caldwell, and if you don't know the story of Sandra Caldwell, I admonish you, please go look her up, because Sandra Caldwell is such a pioneer where we'll get to Sandra Caldwell a little later. So let's start from the beginning where they talk about it. So they start off talking about where they have these trans women speaking about some of their earliest images of trans people in the media. And one of the earliest ones that they talk about is Flip Wilson's character, Geraldine. Also, an episode of The Jeffersons where there was this character named Edie Stokes, and it was a man whose name was Eddie and had a sex change and became Edie. And it was actually played by a beautiful, I'm not familiar if it was played by an actual cis woman or if it was played by a trans woman, but the person actually was very beautiful. It was a bona fide woman. But then, because George Jefferson didn't want his wife Weezy to think he was cheating on her or anything like that, he had an actual man that looked like this rough, masculine dude just put on this crazy wig and this dress and go and say that he was the real Edie Stokes, and I really wasn't the real Edie Stokes. So I'm glad they mentioned that, because I don't even remember, and I think I would like to say I've seen all of the episodes of The Jefferson, but I clearly did not remember that episode. And what that means is that's not an episode that they show very often. When you see The Jeffersons in syndication, that's not one of the episodes that you see that they, that's in heavy rotation. So that's another example of how, disenfranchised the trans community has been at times in the media. And they talk about the fact that trans women have been or trans people or trans images of trans people have been in media as long as there's been motion pictures, as long as there's been cinema. And they show images and films back as early as 1901. When we're talking about clearly what's the inception of motion picture and film and cinema and so forth and so on. We then get to discussing one of what some people consider one of the pioneers in cinema, who is D.W. Griffith, very well known for the film Birth of a Nation. However, D.W. Griffith is somebody who, when you go to film school and when you go and study cinematography and motion picture sciences, he's somebody that you had to learn about. You had to learn the history. He's one of those people in the early days of motion picture that came up with a lot of the blueprints for some of the bare bones motion picture science part of it. And he was a racist, a blatant racist. And not only was he a racist, he had in The Birth of a Nation, he had people in blackface. They mentioned another film called Judith of Bethulia, and it was about this trans person, this trans woman that was it was about a I don't want to get it wrong. It was about this woman who lived in Jerusalem, and it was a trans woman, but it was really a man. And so it was demeaning to the trans community there. And the whole thing about D.W. Griffiths that they were saying was that D.W. Griffiths his films started that stereotype where trans people became the butt of the joke. All of the time you see trans people in television decades and decades and decades after this, and even to this day, it's always being the brunt of the joke. And those stereotypes were started with some of the works of D.W. Griffith. There was another movie they talked about called A Florida Enchantment, where there was this woman that took this pill and became a man. And then there was also racism with blackface in it. He was just, some of the depictions of people of color as well as trans people were just deplorable. And so they talked about where some of these horrible archetypes and stereotypes of trans people originate in the media. And certainly D.W. Griffiths is a part of that history. So then there was an interesting conversation that I wish that they would have spent a little more time on, probably because I'm being anthropomorphic. But they had this conversation about black straight men often playing a trans role, where you had a black straight man that was dressing as a woman. And they talked about Flip Wilson and Jamie Foxx and Martin Lawrence. And you can name, countless, straight black man after straight black man that did that. And there's this, I forgot the name of it, but there's this interesting piece that I saw maybe a year or two ago by Jay Farrell, and it's Jay Farrell and Jamie Foxx. And Jamie Foxx is telling Jay Farrell that in order for you to make it as a credible comedic black actor, you got to dress in drag and you got to dress as a woman, which, is not a good depiction of the trans community. Actually, it's poking fun and making fun of real people. So you have that part of it. The fact that these roles often do, yes, it's comedic, yes, it's funny at times, but there are often times where this straight guy playing this trans woman becomes the butt of the joke. And there goes back to those stereotypes and archetypes we talked about from the origins of motion pictures. Then we talk about, we pit that with a lot of times that was happening, or television wanted to show black men that way to demasculate them. Because it goes back to the whole conversation about when white people would lynch black men, one of the first things they would do is they would cut off their genitalia in the lynchings. And that's a whole nother conversation. And I thought about doing a video about that. I still might. But that was one of the main things that they would go to. As soon as they lynched a black man, they would cut off their genitalia to demasculate them. And so by having these straight black men dress in drag or become these trans women, that was another form of demasculinizing. I'm not even saying the word. Emasculating the black man. And that was a very great conversation piece there that I wish they talked about longer. Then they talked about some other films that highlighted trans people. They Lamb. Silence of the Lambs, and how, if you remember, Buffalo Bill, was it Buffalo Bill? I forgot the name of the serial killer's name in Silence of the Lamb, but if you remember, he was a man that was killing women because he wanted to take the women's clothing and appropriate women and put their skin on top of him, and there was that whole situation there with Silence of the Lambs. And so now somebody who's a trans person is seen and depicted as this horrible psychopath and sociopath and psychotic serial killer. So there's this perpetuation of trans people being these oddities and these caricatures and these awful people and these people that should be shunned, or these people that should always be the butt of the jokes, and not acknowledging that these are actual real people with real feelings and real emotions and deal with real situations in life. So, great conversation was had and these conversations are being had by people in the industry. All of the people that were in this documentary are people who are writers or producers or filmmakers or actors or actresses themselves who are trans. These are not gay men telling the stories. These are not lesbian women telling the stories. These are authentic trans people telling the stories. Trans people who are in media, film, and so forth. And so it's important that they are telling their stories and they are communicating how horrible their depiction is on the screen. So then there was the conversation about how even for trans people, the first interaction or the first images of any trans person that you see in most cases is on screen, is on television or in a movie. So first impressions, are lasting impressions. Doesn't mean that they last forever, but they can last a long time, and it could really shape how you feel about those group of people or even yourself. And so they talk about how over the years, as a trans person, when you're a child and your first image is what you see on screen, many times it's horrific. And it's so few times that you do see a trans person that you go, oh, that's the one who I, should be looking toward. That's the person who I should, try to say, okay, here's an example of somebody who I should, look up to. And so they start to then talk about images and examples of trans people in the media that started to change and move the needle. So they talked about the L Word. And if you remember the character Max on the L Word, who was a lesbian, who started off as a lesbian, but then started taking hormones and transitioning from a woman to a man, and how that made the process of trans maybe not look in a positive light, because here they were showing this transitioning, but they were showing that the hormones were making her more violent or making him more violent and so forth, and making Max, act out and do horrible things. And if you watch the L Word, that whole storyline and the arc of that character was very important because for a lot of people, that was the first time that they got to see truly what it was to have somebody transition, and not just talk about, okay, here's the sex change and you had a sex change. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. They talked about how you had movies in the early 80s that depicted trans people. Movies like Yentl, which is heralded as a movie with Barbra Streisand. I mean, my song is Papa, Can You Hear Me? I love Yentl. I love Barbra Streisand in Yentl. Please. Or the show the movie Victor Victoria. And I remember I stumbled upon the movie Victor Victoria because we were at my grandmother used to go around. She used to help clean up people's houses and stuff like that who were destitute, some who were strung out on crack, and they had a lot of kids, and the house was filthy, and we would go there and we would clean the house. My grandmother would help clean the house and put food in the house, and make sure the kids were good because the parents were strung out on drugs. Anyway, we were doing that one day, and there was this VHS tape, and we had only one VHS tape back in the day, and the VHS tape the only one we had in our house was Lean on Me, which is why I love that movie. I know it word for word. Anyway, when we were cleaning up this house, I found the VHS of the movie Victor Victoria. And I remember I didn't want my grandmother to know that I had stolen it from the house. And I didn't want anybody to know, so I hid it underneath my shirt and in my underwear. like right here in my stomach or whatever. And I went home and I remember I waited till everybody went to sleep. And it wasn't because I didn't even know what the movie was about. But I remember saying, well, I just want to see what it is. I just want to watch this movie and I don't want nobody to know that I stole it. So I remember watching it and was like so confused as a little boy about, okay, the whole androgyny of it all and the whole trans thing. I was really confused, but I remember that's one of my first memories and depictions of a trans person. And this had to be late 80s or so. Then they started talking about, even with all of the images that you see of trans women on screen, going all the way back to the inception of motion pictures, very few images of trans men or trans boys are on screen, even to this day, and how there's this absence of trans men or trans boys. And so then they talked about characters that depicted, trans boys or trans men. Like, if you remember, Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird was this tomboy, which, they just said was a tomboy. But one has the question, and if you read the book, this was a trans boy through and through. Jerry Springer had, in the early days of Jerry Springer, they had trans women, but one of the earliest depictions of a true trans man, they talked about this image of a trans man named Reno, which was the early to mid 90s. And a lot of trans men and boys at the, a lot of little girls who were questioning their own sex and who they were, looked at, depictions of themselves in this Reno character. And when they showed the clip, just the way that trans man spoke about being trans and how he should be respected. And no, when people would say, well, what are you? He said, no, I am a transsexual. I'm a trans. And, we're correcting people and really educating people on it. On a show like Jerry Springer, believe it or not, because if you remember Jerry Springer before it transitioned into what it is today, Jerry Springer, in the beginning of Jerry Springer, even though he would have these different things, was always centered around really educating people about things that was going on in America. And then it turned into just the fighting and all of that stuff. But yeah. So then they talked about the images of trans women in the media often being that of sex workers, always being the prostitute, always, oh, you have this woman. No, oh, it's really not a woman. Oh, it's really a man. And always being a sex worker. And now that was always the thing. In order to get a role as a trans woman, you had to play a sex worker. That was all the work they would get. Similar to how, some black women in olden days and in the early days of cinema could only play maids and or slaves and things like that. And even black men could only play certain roles, and so they were, they were pigeonholed into this one group, this one type of character. They were typecast, so to speak. You have trans women who are always dying on screen. Every time you see a trans woman or a character trans woman, then we start to see not only were they a sex worker, but they were always ending up dead. They were always being killed off. And so there goes that narrative that, they're already dying. So let's keep perpetuating that. Let's not show them living in their truth. Let's not show them, being successful. Let's not show them being real, genuine people with lives and feelings and emotions and careers and families. Let's just show them being sex workers and ultimately dying. And then they talked about how even when they did play credible roles, it would always point back to them being trans, not just them being who they were. For example, you had a trans woman who may be dying of prostate cancer because the prostate was never removed, even though they had a sex change, or a trans woman who was going through hormone treatments, and the hormone treatments caused them cancer. And so now they had to talk all about how they have hormone treatments and they're transitioning instead of just, mentioning them being a woman having breast cancer or whatever cancer. Then they talked about Ryan Murphy and his younger days as a producer and things like that, and the show Nip Tuck, and how horrific Nip Tuck. The trans characters on Nip Tuck, all of them were awful, just awful. Go back and look at Nip Tuck if you remember. There were a couple of them, but they were awful. We're not even going to spend a lot of time on it because Ryan Murphy has grown since then. But Nip Tuck was awful in how they depicted trans people on that show. Then there was the movie Boys Don't Cry. And if you remember, the movie Boys Don't Cry was based on an actual real story of the killing of these people. But anyway, there was this trans man in Boys Don't Cry that was played by, I think it was, who was it, Hilary Swank that played the main character. If you remember the film Boys Don't Cry, I liked how in this documentary they showed how the white trans people spoke about it and how they needed to go see it and they identified with it and they wanted, to go see it because although it was horrific and horrible, it was empowering. Then they showed some black trans people talking about it. And I noticed that how they talked about it was very different. And so what they started to go into was, if you remember the actual story of the killing of these people who died in this situation, there was a black man that was there. If you remember, there was a black man, his name was Philip Divine. I remember that story when it came out. And when they did the movie, they completely wrote the black man out of the story. Completely wrote him out. Mind you, he died as well. But he was completely written out of the story, which went back to how Hollywood, even in the story, when they're talking about trans community, sometimes like to whitewash the story. You get this whitewashing. So they talked about the whitewashing, even within depictions of the trans community in Hollywood or in the media. And then they talked about the film Stonewall, how that was whitewashed. And they made it like it was white gay men that started the fight. And they forgot the story of Sylvia and the story of Marsha and how they were the ones and how it was the trans people of color that were the ones that started the movement. So they had a good conversation about the whitewashing within even the LGBTQIA plus community. That was a great conversation. I was glad that they talked about that. Then we started to talk about people that really started to be the standard bearers for the trans community and started to really change the narratives. People like Christine Jorgensen and Caroline Cossey and so forth, and how they started to do interviews and they started to go on television and really educate people on the trans community. One of the things that Kristen Jorgensen talked about was the fact that when she would go on talk shows and things like that, the fact that everybody focuses on simply the transition, the operation, the surgery, the genitalia part, negating that there's a whole process that goes along with it. There's a process of figuring out that you may be trans. There's a process of once you do decide that you want to change your sex, that you have to go through counseling, years and years of counseling, hormonal treatments, years and years of this. And while people simply focus on the surgery, they negate the whole process that this took. And I equate it to like a story, like a novel. Nobody reads a novel. You open it up and say, okay, let me just go directly to the climax because that's all I need to know. No, you have exposition and a whole lot of rising action that happens throughout that novel before you get to the climax, which is usually toward the end. And so you need all of that exposition and rising action to tell the story of that novel. Just like for a trans person, you can't just start off by talking about, oh, when did you have your penis cut off? Or when did you have your vagina turned into a penis? You have to talk about the whole process because there's a whole process that goes along with that. And that was something that she highlighted. They talked about Caroline Cossey and how when she went on the Arsenio Hall show, and Arsenio Hall talked about discussed her having to tuck and what that meant to tuck and how painful that was. And she had handled it with grace and dignity. And how back in this was, back in the 80s and 90s and things when, a lot of the pioneers had to be able to take this kind of bigotry and discrimination and handle it with dignity and class in order to allow the people of today to be able to be unapologetic and brash and, blunt and in your face about who they are. Yeah, and that's an important conversation. And then there was that. So then there began this whole conversation of how talk shows, because if you remember, the 80s and 90s talk shows were a big thing, a huge thing. Daytime talk shows, the Phil Donahue Show, Sally Jesse Raphael, Oprah Winfrey, even Jerry Springer, Maury Povich. Talk shows were, Ricky Lake shows, talk shows were a huge part of the media at that time, and how you started to see trans people come on these shows and talk about who they were, talk about their lives, and educate people on the trans community and how important that was. Then there was this conversation, and I highlighted this in my notes, but there was this conversation that They didn't spend a lot of time on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but it's a whole conversation. There was a conversation on where it was stated that by one of the people on the documentary that trans people should never have to tell their mate or the person that they're with that they were originally a different sex, that mate or that person should just accept them who they are at that point, and that they shouldn't be forced to have the conversation and say, hey, yes, I'm a woman, but if just so you know, I used to be a man, or hey, I'm a man, but just so you know, I used to be a woman. There was a conversation had by them, by a couple individuals saying, why do we have to have the conversation? And that's a whole Pandora's box, because that gets very heated in that argument. There's a lot of things being said on both sides of that argument. And I'm not going to get into that, but that was a part of this documentary, which I'm glad they mentioned that, because that's a conversation as well when you're talking about the stories of trans individuals. Then they talked about when trans women started to play cis women roles. So you had a role that was originally just the character is a actual cis woman, but the role, the actress playing it, was a trans woman. So you started to talk about people like Sandra Caldwell, who is a black trans woman who people never knew was a man. They never knew was a man. Played roles with all kinds of people, and people never knew. She was outed in the New York Times and things like that, way after she had played, dozens of films and things like that. And they talked about, roles like in Hairspray. What was the mom's name in Hairspray? Oh, it's gonna come to me. I thought I wrote. Edna Turnblad. Edna Turnblad in Hairspray. Remember, that's a mother, a cis woman, but the character is played by what is obviously a trans woman. And things like that happening. Then they talked about how even with all of the strides that they started to make in media and film, then we have to be brought back 1,000 steps back. And they talked about the film The Crying Game. And if you remember the film The Crying Game, the big thing about The Crying Game was the woman that you thought was a woman ends up being a man, has a penis. You actually see the penis on, film and so forth. And the man going and vomiting for several minutes over there. And that introduced that stereotype that now, well, not the stereotype, but the notion that trans people and their bodies are something that should be revolted or something disgusting, and something that they should be, the sight of a trans person's body is something that is just revolting. And so even to this day, if you think about it, they started showing images of every time, or in a movie or in a television show, every time they talked about someone trans, there was this person that would immediately start vomiting. And how that, just puts trans people once again in a negative light. It's just great conversations that were had, and things that you just don't think about, that are just covert, and inconspicuously in media and in films, that you just don't think about unless you are someone that's trans and that's your story. And so I think it was important that we saw that this documentary was done by all trans people, so that they could tell you, this hurts me, this is how this makes me feel, and it opens your eyes to, never really thought about that way. And some of the things that you found funny, when you go back and look, if that was you wouldn't find it so funny. And it made me take a step back. You have people like Lily Wachowski, and if you don't know who Lily Wachowski is the writer and director of The Matrix, and how, what they were doing by, being in large, very big movies, how they still had to tell their stories under the cloak and guise of a character, and have it really, really embedded in certain roles. So it was a real interesting conversation. Then they talk about Paris is Burning. And now we want to talk about and start to highlight trans people of color, and how the Latino and his Latino or Latinx and black trans people, and how a lot of the trans people of color ends up having themselves appropriated and sometimes misappropriated by pop culture, because Paris is Burning highlighted the ballroom scene and so forth, and this highlights trans, a lot of times trans people of color, and now the entire pop culture begins to appropriate and sometimes misappropriate this whole community and this whole group of people. and they talked about how people started to think, oh yeah, Madonna invented Vogue, and people start to think that Vogue didn't start until this time, when it was a thing way back, and these people just had been in the shadows for years and years and years. And so you use this, a lot of time, white person or this pop culture figure to appropriate and sometimes misappropriate these people who have always been there, and you just negate and forget the people who actually were the ones living the life, walking the walk and talking the talk. Great conversation there. They talked about Chaz Bono and what the film Becoming Chaz did for the trans community, as well as Chaz Bono being on Dancing with the Stars, and how that opened up doors for the trans community, with millions of eyes being on a trans person like that. Shows like Orange is the New Black and Laverne Cox and what she did for the trans community, and Janet Mock and what she's done for the trans community. They even talked about how the trans community even was involved in the Me Too movement. In the there was a movie Transparent, and one of the producers by the name of Jeffrey Tambor had sexually harassed the trans woman in the film, but still yet won Emmys and things like that. They even brought up the Katie Couric, and I remember at the time the Katie Couric interview that she had with Carmen Carrera and Laverne Cox, where she wanted to focus on the surgery, and she was saying, "So you cut off your penis," and it was an uncomfortable conversation. It was deemed really insensitive, and how Katie Couric had to backpedal and pussy pop and do a whole nother interview in the aftermath, and had to educate herself and learn and grow, and ended up having another interview with Laverne Cox after that, to clean it up or whatever. But that whole conversation, there was even a conversation about the acceptance of parents and showing parents in the media being accepting of their trans child, and how that can be empowering for young boys and girls that may be struggling with who they are, with their gender. And then, and so as we got to the culmination, they talked about shows like Pose that are now highlighting the stories of the trans community and depicting and talking about how you have hundreds, if not thousands, of trans women of color that are being butchered and slaughtered all over the fruited plains. The atrocities that are happening, and the story of the death of Candy on Pose, went a long way to highlight that we have trans women of color being slaughtered all over this country, and we need this to be told in the media. And and this was toward the end of the documentary, but what is taken away from the documentary are the images that we see of trans people on screen truly helping the trans people off screen. What are we doing so that the images of trans people we see in the media, or movies, on television shows, on the internet, on whatever platform, are those images and depictions of trans people truly helping trans people that are not on screen? Are they moving the needle so we can start to hear less stories? I shouldn't say start to hear less, so that there has to be less stories of the killings of trans women, so that there are more Zaya Wades out there that are willing to stand up and be out there and have a family behind them that supports them, so that people who aren't on camera can feel empowered and live their lives and be themselves. That was the documentary, y'all, and it was a great conversation piece, great starter. I'm so glad that I watched it, and I think that it's something that if you are an ally of the LGBT community, LGBT plus community, you certainly want to watch it. If you are trans, it certainly is something that you need to see. If you are in the LGBTQIA plus community, it's something you definitely probably want to put on your watch list. It is on Netflix. It's called Disclosure. Yeah, go check it out. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Let's continue the conversation in the comment section. Y'all know how I like to say, let's get down in the comments and aga about what we saw, about your own thoughts and opinions on if and when you do go watch the documentary, what was said that may be different from what I saw or how I viewed it. But once again, thank you, Sir James, for your recommendation. Y'all know I'm always, I always encourage recommendations for things for me to watch or review. I can't promise you that I'll always do it, but I certainly will be inclined to give it a watch and say, oh yeah, let me go review this. So thank you so much. And until my next review, that's all I have for y'all. Thank y'all for coming. Y'all drive safely. I'm out.